You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Brought to you by Kaishax, helping you deliver through volatility.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, where are you calling from?
I'm calling in from Santiago de Compostela in the northwest corner of Spain. Lovely summer here, as you can see.
That sounds awesome. Let's jump into it. We've got a long episode today with a lot of good information, so let's get going with that. I'll share my screen here, and we can get started with the latest read on NYFI.
Yeah, Asia-US West Coast that we're starting off with here. Sure, there's a little bit of variation in the rate, but the long and short of it is rates have flatlined. They've flatlined now. This is the fourth consecutive week where we are basically at the same level in terms of the NYFI. Some that are following other indices, notably if you follow the Shanghai Container Freight Index, the SCFI, might have noticed the SCFI have skyrocketed in the last couple of weeks. That is not reflected here on the NYFI. Keep in mind, though, the SCFI, again, is mainly quoted rates, which means that these quotes may or may not materialize. And even if bookings are made, these bookings may or may not show up eventually, or may not get loaded. This is the potential phantom GRI we've talked upon before, where it's not always that these quoted increases are subsequently reflected in what actually happens. The NYFI, as I think we have explained before, is measured only on the basis of cargo that is actually loaded. And this is, you can say, important, right? Because from any shipper out there knows that the moment you get a quote, that is not the day where you load your cargo. When you get a quote, even if you say yes at that very moment, that would not be for a booking today. That might be for a booking typically a couple of weeks, sometimes 3 weeks out, where first you would need to then arrange your trucker, go pick up the empty container, take it to your factory, fill that container, go down, gate it into the terminal, typically a few days before the vessel arrives, and then eventually the cargo gets loaded. There are some that would mention that means that the NYFI is a lagged index. I wouldn't categorize it as that. NYFI is not lagged. The NYFI measures the price exactly at the point in time when the cargo is loaded. And the reason for doing that is precisely not to include ghost bookings that never materialize, ghost quotes that never result in bookings, quotes on cargo that might get booked but never loaded because cargo is rolled. That's basically the difference. So the interesting part here is whether the increases the last 2 weeks on the SCFI will then materialize in the NYFI. We have in the past seen that is not always the case, and it appears to me we might be seeing some phantom GRIs yet again. Market has become a little bit more unsettled. We can see it in the graph here, where the spread that we talked about did widen a bit compared to last week. But it does appear that we are actually still at the peak of the market.
Before we move on, I wanted to dig in just a little bit more on the timing differences. So I got a question last week talking about I'm seeing rates getting quoted to me from carriers that include an August GRI. Like, when would I expect to see that reflected in the NYFI rates? Could you talk about how that timing works?
Again, if you're quoted a GRI, say on August 1st, that might be on cargo you then load, say, August 15th, August 20th, right around that. So that's when you would actually see it show up. You can say, why this difference? Why only measure when you get loaded? There's this illusion that you get more fresh data if you look at the quotes. Sure, you can get a quote today, but you have no idea whether anybody actually pays that price. And then we go all the way down to the core of what is one of the purposes of the NYFI index. It's to serve as an index underlying, for example, futures contract. And if you have an index-linked contract, that's what you need to really take advantage of futures markets. And for an index-linked contract, you want to pay an index that reflects the market. You don't want to pay an index that reflects quotes that never actually resulted in booking. That way, you actually end up overpaying on your index-linked contract. That's why it's pivotal to have an index where you measure only on cargo actually loaded, which of course creates this effect where the quotes today, no, they're not reflected in the NYFI today, You will see 2 or 3 weeks later on whether that actually happened at all. And in some cases, it doesn't.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. Let's switch and talk about the futures rates right now for Asia to US West Coast.
Yeah, because what we're seeing here, and if you also toggle on the forward curve last week, what we see here is there's been a slight adjustment upwards for the forward curve. Not by a lot, but an adjustment upwards. So the expectation of stakeholders out there is also very much that we have seen the peak. We are about to see the slide down that we always do after peak. Mind you, this is a peak ending earlier than usual, but it also started earlier. But the expectation is very much in line with the read on the market as well. We are past the peak. The slide down might be a little more slow than what was expected a few weeks ago, but a slide nonetheless. US West Coast is to some degree inextricably linked to the US East Coast. So if we look at the US East Coast forward rates at the same time, we see exactly the same pattern. We see that the East Coast rates have also peaked. They came down now this week as well. We see the forward curve still very much go down, but it has been adjusted upwards slightly in the coming months here. Again, reflecting, yes, we're past the peak, but maybe the come down will not be quite as rapid as what was thought a couple of weeks ago.
Awesome. And let's touch on Asia and North Europe as well. What do we see here?
Yeah, if we look at Asia North Europe, not quite the same image. It's the same image here that we are past the peak. Peak season also came early, ended early on Asia Europe. We continue to slide this week as well. There's not really been much change in the forward curve, so the expectation everybody had in the forward market is basically being lived up to. The expectation is and has been for quite a while that yes, this was the end of the peak season, and we will see a gradual slow decline. The decline we see here is slower. It's not as rapid as what we see in the Pacific. So a tapering off would be more the correct assessment in terms of what the market condition is that we're going into on Asia-Europe.
Awesome. All right. Anything else you want to add about this, or should we talk about some new interesting data from CTS?
Let's jump into demand because there's a few fun things to dig into once you really open the hood and look at the actual data.
All right, let's do it.
CTS, or Container Trade Statistics, they come with data on cargo based on cargo load date. That's also important. Just as with the spot rate indices, for demand is also important when are things measured. So this is the newest data. This is data of June. I know quite a few of our listeners here are in the US and will be accustomed to, for example, customs data coming from peers or other sources. You will already be able to get July data. So I've seen some confusion at times also. Why do you say June is the newest data when we got July? Keep in mind, CTS measures at time of loading. Here's data is at time of delivery. So July data, when that arrives, actually reflect cargo that was loaded back in June. So it's not that July data are newer by any stretch of the imagination. Furthermore, and again, this is the, you can say, the tedious methodology part. If you want to assess supply demand and see how that impacts on freight rates, it's the supply demand situation at time of loading that's important, not at the time of when the cargo eventually makes it to destination, because that is weeks and months after anybody accepted a quote and made a booking. There's load date on demand. That's actually important in this context. That was a very long digression before I get to the actual numbers. Sorry about that. But if we look at the overall data globally, global demand grew again 5.5% in June. Very strong, solid growth, continuing the solidity we've seen in the market for a couple of years now. As I've also done in recent months, I've also taken a look at what if we look at the world, but excludes North America and excludes Middle East, India as a continent, in order to look at what does the world look like without the U.S. trade war effect and without the Hormuz effect. In this case, June, rest of the world, without U.S. trade war, without Hormuz, grew 10%. We have seen this double-digit growth a few times over the last year, and it simply shows demand around the world, if we exclude the Hormuz effect and we exclude the U.S. trade war effect, demand globally is phenomenally strong, sustained for a long period of time. Now, when we then start to dig further in, I said this is without North America and the Hormuz effect. For North America, this is where life really becomes interesting when you look at it. There is this perception that because freight rates have become so strong on Transpacific, surely there is a demand boom. I'm going to say something that immediately is going to sound counterintuitive, but bear with me a second because it's actually very logical. If we look at June, the CTS data, which are usually very accurate, what they showed was that North American imports were down 0.2%. 0.2% is almost nothing, so the right way to state it basically is U.S. imports did not grow in June. This is on a year-on-year basis. U.S. exports are actually down almost 2%. And then it comes where people might get baffled. If demand is so sluggish, why did we see these phenomenally strong freight rates? Capacity here is the answer. Because we can go to another credible source here. In this case, I tend to go to the Sea Intelligence data on actual deployed capacity. They measure it on a named vessel basis. And then I looked at, if this is the cargo that was loaded in June in Asia going to North America, how much vessel capacity did we see in the month of June leave Asia? So what's the growth rate there? This is where it's interesting, and it's also basically zero. So in the month of June, demand from Asia to North America did not grow, but neither did capacity, which means the supply and demand balance in the Pacific in June was exactly the same that it was in June last year. Now, what did we see on the NYFI spot rates a year ago? A year ago, if we look at, say, Asia-US West Coast, now I'm talking very round numbers, not to confuse people too much. Last year, during the month of June, we saw rates go from $3,000 to $5,000. Last year in June. So from $3,000 to $5,000. This year, rates went from $3,000 to $5,000. So rates did exactly the same as they did last year. Again, extremely round numbers. If we look at US East Coast, rates went from 4,000 to 6,500. It did it in June last year. It did exactly the same this year. So for the month of June, supply demand did not grow, but it was also the same as last year. And lo and behold, freight rates were also exactly the same, which is what you would expect if market rates are set by supply and demand dynamics. There might be, hang on, the market peak was not reached in June, which is absolutely true. The rates peaked quite a bit into July. So what happened to supply and demand in July? If we want to be fact-based and base it on data, we can't tell yet because we don't have the CTS data. We don't have the demand data solidly for July yet. So we're going to have to wait for that one to see what happened. But the notion that there was a demand boom in June, that is simply not correct. That is not borne out by the data. But rates were strong? Absolutely, yes. They were exactly the same level as what we saw last year when the market was also strong. So that has been the development in June on the Pacific. Doesn't quite fit a lot of the narratives out there. This is what the hard data is showing us. If we look at some of the other trades, however, we definitely see a massive boom in demand. And that is what has been driving a lot of other spot rates in other markets up. Again, let me try to throw out a few numbers there. Asia-Europe in June, the other pivotal east-west trades. Loaded volume up 17% year on year. That is a massive increase. But even that is dwarfed. Asia-South America is up 25%. And Asia to Africa up as much as 30% in the month of June. So this stagnation of demand is mainly unique to the head haul Transpacific. Other major head haul trades, not just Europe, but also South America and Africa, are just booming there in June. You might say, if capacity didn't grow on Pacific, what happened to all the ships? There you have it. They went to all the other trades where demand was growing gangbusters and the ships were sorely needed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what are we seeing now in terms of like pre-pandemic to June of 2026? Are we seeing demand patterns changing throughout the different economies?
Indeed. And you can say I wanted to drop a little bit about Africa in here, given obviously on the Synchro Sally voyage, I should be crossing the Strait of Gibraltar in 3 weeks' time, give and take. But if we look especially at Africa, if we look globally, not Africa specifically, but global demand volume, if we compare June this year to June 2019, pre-pandemic, global growth is actually not up all that much. 13%, that's it. Keep in mind, this is growth over 7 years. So global growth, 13%, not much. Africa, on the other hand, Africa exports have grown 33%, and their imports have grown 44%. By far the largest growth rates any region out there. The import growth of 44%. The runner-up is South America, which has grown only 29%. So there's a huge gap out there. As we're staying on the data here, for those that are not completely tired on me throwing numbers out there, there are more numbers that are actually interesting as well. And that's on the trade imbalances. Again, let's focus on North America first. If I compare over the pandemic, so June 2019 to June that just passed now, North America's imports are up 23%. But exports, they are down 21%. That's a massive widening of the imbalance. See the same pattern in Europe. Imports are up 13%. Exports are down 11%. So we've clearly seen a period over these 7 years where, at least as far as containerized cargo goes, North America and Europe imports more and more cargo, but is able to sell and export less and less cargo. It's not just that the export growth rates are low. No, they are outright negative over 7 years. And for the carriers, this of course means widening imbalances. Head haul cargo therefore has to pay a larger share of the round trip costs, changing the whole pricing dynamic for all the carriers. The opposite one to this is Far East, because Far East, this is where the boom is. This is where all this added cargo is really coming from. So if we look in before the pandemic, exports out of Far East Asia were about 32% more than imports. Now it's 42%. And for some, it might be difficult to look at percentages. Sometimes a simple number is easier to reflect it. So what if I was to zoom in on the Far East and look at how many TEU are imported and exported every second, or rather loaded every second? If we try to put some real numbers on it, if we look at Far East, every second, 4.2 TEU, so more than 4 containers are loaded onto a ship every single second. Whereas when it then comes to importing, it's only, in quotation marks, 2.5 TEU every second. So this is still more than 4 TEU every second. Another way to put it, if you think of these giant 24,000 TEU ships, every hour there's cargo to fill one of those. This is an amazing amount of cargo that is being exported here.
That really puts it into perspective, the numbers that we're dealing with here. Per second is, okay, yeah, that's a lot, but wow, that's pretty crazy.
Yes, it is. But that's the nature of numbers. Sometimes it is fun to lift the hood and actually look underneath and see what are we talking about here, because these are not small trade flows at all.
Yeah. Awesome. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add to the CTS data conversation here?
No, I think that should be more than sufficient for one episode here.
I think it's all really fascinating, and thanks for sharing all of that. I know our listeners want to know what's going on with the Hormuz situation. Any updates here that you want to talk through?
Yeah, I think Hormuz, there's not really much to say because nothing has changed compared to last week. Hormuz is still effectively closed. Ships risk getting shot at. There are constant rumors about deals. It's almost like the old TV show, Deal No Deal. There's not really any tangible change. And it doesn't appear there's going to be any tangible change anytime soon. So carriers deployments on Hormuz are not changing at all. This is, however, very different when you then start to go over and look over on the Red Sea side. Because if you look over on the Red Sea, there is significant change afoot, I would say. What we saw last week was an announcement from COSCO and OOCL. Keep in mind, OOCL is owned by COSCO, so the Chinese. They are starting a direct Asia to Red Sea service that it appears they are going to operate. This is important because that means we now have a Chinese carrier, the largest one out there, actually begin to send ships through the Bab el-Mandeb. despite the new blockade from the Houthis, which seems mainly in effect to target Saudi tankers. So that was another indication here before the weekend that we might slowly be approaching a normalization of the Red Sea. Then here this morning, there was news coming out from Maersk that yet another Asia-Europe service is now going to be shifted back to a Suez routing. It's a Gemini service, so now they have two, the AE15 and the AE19. My apologies to Hapag-Lloyd, I can't remember off the top of my head what the name they have. They have different names for them. But that means now two of the Gemini services will be going through. So we are clearly seeing a normalization slowly begin in the Red Sea, despite all the other turmoil going on in the Middle East. That is significant.
Definitely. I think the steps towards normalization are maybe a breath of fresh air as well for a lot of shippers.
Yes.
Are there any other changes with routings coming up?
There are likely changes with routings coming up in the Panama Canal. I know we have mentioned it before, but in the week since we spoke last, a new advisory was issued by the Panama Canal authorities. They are now reducing the draft even further here over the next month, all the way down to 47.5 feet. Normally, the restriction is 50 feet. They have then, over the last couple of months, gradually been reducing it. It's not because that they are short on water in the Panama Canal right now. They are not. The problem is all forecasts point towards an extremely strong El Nino season. And with an extremely strong El Nino season comes low rainfall and therefore problems with sufficient water in the Panama Canal. So what the Panama Canal authorities are really doing here is they are beginning water management and conservation efforts already now in order to at least mitigate the negative impact that is almost certain to come when we get to the end of the year. Will there be more to come if the weather forecasts are correct? Absolutely yes. We can talk about that next week because the second Thursday of every month, there is a new forecast update for exactly the El Nino, so we can see where that is bearing. But any shipper out there that uses the Panama Canal to move their cargo should already now begin to draw up their contingency plans. Contingency plan number one would simply be start planning for you're going to pay more because there will be added surcharges for low water coming up when capacity restrictions start to bite, and start to look through what are your alternative routing options. You may not like what your alternative options are, but it's better to map them out and be prepared now because this is likely going to bite some of the shippers.
Yeah, definitely. And we've also seen some water shortages elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yeah, in Europe, we've had multiple heat waves, and that has caused extremely low water in the Rhine River, which is one of the main arteries for feeding a lot of the barge traffic here in Europe. Driving sadly down through Europe, I've definitely felt part of those heat waves as well. And yeah, they have been fierce. And quite a few barge services have now stopped completely because there's simply not enough water. And here comes the problem. Remember earlier in this podcast when we talked about demand, that demand loaded cargo in June, Asia to Europe, was up 17%. This is the demand right now that's being moved inland. And when suddenly some of the barge services are no longer there, this needs to be moved on road and rail. But road and rail are already chock-a-block full, dealing with that 17% surge in demand. So there's a massive pressure now on being able to move cargo inland in Europe. And mind you, you're also approaching low water levels elsewhere in the Amazon, where carriers are beginning to announce surcharges also in expectation of unusually low waters in the Amazon River, which impacts cargo going up to the port in Manaus.
All right. Yeah. So definitely a global issue that shippers are facing. All right. Anything else you want to add today, Lars?
I think I wanted to add just one more thing. Now we talked about heat waves that move to the cold. Some might have seen headlines that a Chinese carrier, Sea Legend Shipping, is going to start a regular service from Asia to Europe using the Northern Sea Route. That's the one where you move not across the North Pole, but you move along basically the Siberian coastline. And yes, it is factually true that they have announced they're going to operate these ships. I believe they want to have 8 sailings, and they're probably going to want to do it as well. What I want to throw out there is also that this should not be exaggerated in terms of importance. First of all, vessels are relatively small. This is the proverbial drop in the bucket in terms of capacity between Asia and Europe. That's one thing. then it's being heralded as the first regular service. Sure, if 8 weeks is regular, because then it's going to be closed down again because things are going to freeze over. Usually in liner shipping, regular means on an annual basis, this would be 8 sailings. That's about it. Will they all sail on time? That, of course, remains to be seen. They have icebreaker assistance from the Russian Rosatom agency that operates the Russian nuclear icebreakers, so it might happen. I just want to remind people, last year, we also saw a number of container ships move across, but when you look at the actual ice-free status of that one, that was only slightly more than a week. There was some elements of ice and icebreaker assistance. You should also keep in mind that if you look at some of the major carriers, especially MSC has been very vocal that they were not going to use the Northern Sea route, because if something goes wrong up there, there isn't any option for salvage. If you do have an oil spill, there's not really anything you can do if containers fall overboard. That hasn't happened with the trial sailings with small container vessels in recent years. Let's hope it doesn't happen this year either. But it is a risk up there. As we can see, weather tends to be somewhat unpredictable. It's then also being promoted as much faster than the traditional sailing route, which is certainly true, especially for the ones going around Africa. But even compared to Suez, this is a shorter transit time. But it is not shorter than the alternative of taking, for example, the rail service through Russia. And the rail service is less likely to incur delays due to sudden changes in ice flows than, for example, a Northern Sea route. So this is not to say it's not going to happen. It is going to happen to some degree, but it might be a little bit overblown in terms of how big a thing this actually is.
Yeah. I guess one of the bigger benefits is that because it would have to happen over the summer where there's not as much ice frozen up there, you have more capacity and more optionality during the peak season from Asia to Europe. So that is, I guess, a nice part of this.
Only partly, because you're really looking usually at the period from late August and then a period ahead from there, which traditionally is towards the end of the peak season on the Asia-Europe trade.
True. Gotcha. I think that's everything for today. Our listeners are probably good to go with information for the rest of the week. Thanks for sharing all that, Lars, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
One comment I would like to make here towards the end, again, just to make sure everybody is aware there's nothing hidden in this. This is, of course, a podcast sponsored by NYFI. We talk about the NYFI index, and what I just would like people to know is I am also a very small investor in NYFI. I believe every piece of analysis I give out there is as objective as I can make it be. If people see it differently, because when I say small, I'm talking less than a percentage. It's not that I have any influence on the company, but I think it's just important to be honest and open about what are people's interests out there.
Totally. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. We'll be back next week for another episode. If you haven't already subscribed, we're on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. And until then, I hope everyone has an awesome week. Bye, y'all.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets podcast, presented by NYFI. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.